Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. We have a very special guest today. Carol Kaye is one of the most accomplished artists in the history of recorded music. As a premier studio musician, she's played on over 10,000 recording sessions and has made substantial contributions to numerous hit songs in a variety of musical genres. If I tried to read a complete list of her recording credits, by the time I was finished, not only would the show be over, but we would have run long. So what I'm going to do instead is play you a few excerpts from some of her many famous recordings.
Escaping home, where my music's playing home, where my love lies waiting silently for me.
I'm picking up good vibrations, she's giving me the excitations. I'm picking up good vibrations, she's giving me the excitations. I'm picking up good vibrations, she's giving me the excitations.
Then I saw her face, now I'm a believer. Not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love, I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried. I still hear your sea winds blowing. I still see her dark eyes glowing. She was 21 when I left Galveston.
America, sweet America. You know, God done shed his grace on thee. He crowned thy good. Yes, he did. Heavy brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
It's hard to believe one musician could have played on so many classic recordings, but the truth is that medley barely scratches the surface of her remarkable and truly unprecedented career. Before we get to the interview, here's a brief overview of her career. In the late 1940s, while still in her teens, she started playing jazz guitar professionally, performing bebop, the most technically demanding form of jazz, with many of the finest musicians of the time. In the late 1950s, she was lured into the studio to record with the great Sam Cooke, a very positive experience which motivated her to continue doing session work. In 1963, after 5 steady years as a studio guitar player, a bass player failed to show up for a session and she was enlisted to fill in. She soon discovered she had a rare knack for creating the type of inventive bass lines that could mean the difference between a song becoming a hit or not. It didn't take long for the top producers to recognize her skill, and she quickly rose to the top of the list of preferred bass players in the Los Angeles recording scene. Throughout the 1960s, she played on numerous hit songs for a wide variety of artists. Then in the 70s, she started focusing more on television and film work. You can hear her playing on the themes of a number of popular TV shows, including Mission Impossible, Get Smart, MASH, Hawaii Five-0, Ironside, Hogan's Heroes, The Streets of San Francisco, and many, many more. She's worked with many of the greatest film composers, including Henry Mancini, Michel Legrand, and John Williams, and she had a particularly good relationship with Quincy Jones, who called her the best bassist he'd ever heard and refused to take on a project without her on board. She played on a number of movie scores, including Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Thomas Crown Affair, In the Heat of the Night, Airport, On Any Sunday, The Poseidon Adventure, Yours, Mine, and Ours, and many more. In the late 70s, she had to retire from music due to health concerns, but thankfully she was able to return in the late 90s and continues to make great music to this day. It was a real pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with Carol Kaye. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Well, I wanted to start by taking you back to your early teenage years and finding out what it was about jazz music that appealed to you so much that inspired you to become a musician.
Well, in those years, you had big bands that played dance music, and there was quite a bit of riffing jazz stuff going on, like with the Goodman Band, the Artie Shaw Band, the Ellington Band, And you heard really good music all the time, and then the bebop started to happen, but I got into the Goodman kind of jazz because my teacher was teaching that, and so I got into the Goodman-style riffs and all that kind of stuff, And after about 3 or 4 months of lessons, then I started to work, And it was great to work because I could make money to help put food on the table at the age of 14,
Wow.
So it was fun, and then it was really good for my mother and me, too, so...
But what was it about jazz as opposed to show tunes or classical music that you said, I want to play jazz?
Well, it was creative. You heard it, and it just felt right, See, around Los Angeles, it was the music of the day, and so
Right.
there were a lot of people that played it in nightclubs and like that. And I used to go up to hear the big band play at $1 million theater up there in Los Angeles. I'd take the PE car from the projects up to downtown Los Angeles as a kid and sit in the front row there, and I saw the Duke Ellington Band and the Basie Band and all those bands in the theater there. And it was exciting, and the music was fun, and it was just great, and the audience just roared. It was a thrill to hear great music like jazz. And so, of course, when I had a chance to play, that's the thing that I could do real well. I couldn't talk very well because I stuttered, and then I had buck teeth in school, and though I got good grades in school, I grew up poor, didn't have much or anything. But that's all right because I went to work anyway and made some money.
What they say about those days was it was a rare period in American music where the best musicians around were also the most popular musicians around. Like a Benny Goodman and a Duke Ellington, and like you say.
Right. Well, it wasn't like stardom. It was like they were the ones that put out the great music, and so you respected them and loved them. But it wasn't quite the stardom that you saw build up later on. Like in the 70s with the live rock groups. It wasn't quite like that. It's that they spread joy,
Right.
and people loved to dance and sing the songs and like that. And it really got very important in the 40s because we had a war to fight. World War II, and people couldn't talk because the saying was true that loose lips sink ships because there's a lot of sabotage going on. And so the only thing that people could do is to go out to dance. And
to have picked up the instrument and then almost immediately, less than a year of picking up the instrument, you were performing professionally, you must have had just a real
4
natural...
months,
right, 4 months.
My parents played music. I heard music as a kid all the time,
So it sounds to me like you had a happy... collaboration of musical parents, a lot of ability yourself, and a good teacher.
Well, it wasn't happy.
Okay, well...
the only time that they didn't fight was when they played music together.
Wow. Well, maybe that's why you wanted to play music, too, so you could all be happy.
Well, it's just something that I could do, and it made a difference in my life. I felt like being alive then, see, and it's something that I could do, and it just felt good.
Since you went through so many phases later in your career, where do you rate those very earliest years in terms of the satisfaction of playing music?
Well, people look at their lives a lot differently than we did back then. Back then, I used music as a tool to make money to take care of myself and to take care of my family and my kids. I had to raise my kids myself, too. And so to be able to do that was great, but jazz did not pay that well, So,
Right.
so I had to take other gigs too, and I was on the road with the big band with my first husband. And so it's the experience of those times. It was still tough because it was hard times.
Right.
People who had gotten back from World War II, then they started their families in the late 40s and the 50s. But for musicians, you still didn't make much money. In other words, you didn't have a choice of what to do, because I never went to college or anything like
Right.
that. I had to go to work, So
Sure.
it was tough times, but you managed to get through it, and you played all kinds of music, and you played it good if you wanted to eat. It was that simple.
I see. So what I was getting at is, financial considerations aside, if you looked back at that as a musically satisfying time, but it sounds like you related in your mind. It was a job.
It was intertwined with trying to eat.
Yeah, well, that makes
At
sense.
all times.
Well, let's go ahead then and talk about your transition into the recording studio, because I know that finances was a consideration in that too. I just think it's important for people to understand that before you ever set foot in a recording studio, you'd been playing for 10 years.
9 years, yeah.
9 years.
It's the 8 years, actually, because my first professional job was in 1949, and that's when I started to teach, too. So I was playing in a bebop club, playing a lot of hot jazz, when a fellow walked in and he says, "You want to do a record date?" And I looked at the rest of the band who seemed to know him, so I said, "Okay." But I never really wanted to do studio work, because it was known if you went into studio work and you had to dumb down to play the music, that you couldn't quite make it back to jazz. And I was getting a big name for myself too at that time, but it was also a time that we saw the jazz clubs start to fold up, and then they would come back as rock clubs. So we saw the handwriting on the wall, and a lot of the guys went into studio work, and I did too, because it helped. It helped be a guitar player at a time that they needed guitar players. So
Oh, yeah.
that's what happened. And then the music was pretty good too. Sam Cooke, the first dates I did were with Sam Cooke, and that was Richie Valens. And then I did a lot of other dates, and I worked for Phil Spector and all that stuff.
Was it hard to go back to jazz because you lost your chops, or because you lost respect of the community?
No, it's not the respect, it's the mind thing. You simply lose your chops in your head. It's creativeness. You can't create better if you're doing ba 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 do 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 or da 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 da. It's entirely different,
It's a simplification.
Yeah, rock and roll is so far from jazz. It's like at the outer limits,
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, most of the people that did the rock and roll dates back then were from the jazz world. You had Glenn Campbell, you had Leon Russell, and those guys too.
Mm-hmm.
But the challenge was trying to come up with some lines that you could invent to make a hit record happen.
Right.
And it was kind of fun at first, because it was a brand new thing, So it was fine for a few years, plus the money you make. You're making as much money as a doctor, but you're recording day and night, though, too. So
Yeah, long hours.
it's hard work.
Well, let me ask you, since you started in the recording in the 50s with Sam Cooke, you were a witness to and a participant in a lot of changes in recording techniques and technology. Everybody used to record simultaneously, and then multi-tracking came along with its emphasis on overdubs and the isolation of each instrument. As somebody who's recorded both ways many times, do you think that overall performance has lost something as a result of all that deconstruction?
Well, it didn't lose much until they started not to record with horns. When they had the horns and the rhythm section together, then you still had a semblance of a creative band that could groove together. But as soon as it got to be just a rhythm section, you had to imagine what the horns were going to sound like on top. Playing bass, by that time I was playing bass anyway. 63 was when somebody didn't show up in the studio and they put the bass in my hands, because I was playing the bass guitar anyway, that clicky thing, and they liked the way I played. So I started to invent lines, and you have to remember not to play too much, because they're going to stack horns on top of you and strings and like that. So yeah, it changed just about every 6 months. It seemed like that they added 2 more tracks, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, by the time I started to do all the Beach Boys stuff, 16 tracks, so it was quite a few tracks, and we thought that they couldn't go any higher than that.
And just hearing you say all that, it just really demonstrates to me what a disadvantage it was to you if you had a click track and a guide vocal and you didn't really know what the finished track was going to sound like.
They would play the tune for you. Now, at first, there wasn't any music written. We had to write our own chord charts out, which is not hard. I mean, just one time through, and we had a chord chart, but we also indicated what to play, what where, too, because we'd hear the person sing or we'd hear a demo of the singing. The music was so simple, it was easy, but it's very hard to create simple lines. So that was the trick. As far as knowing what to put, what where, it was pretty easy, because when you're playing jazz, you invent every single note of every tune, I mean, you're improvising, and then if you're a guitar player, you're going to back the improviser, and you're going to play all kinds of stuff according to what the drummer's doing, the bass player's doing, the singer's singing, if there's any singer or the horns or what, So just narrowing it down to simple rock and roll or soul or R&B or whatever, it was pretty easy, but you had to be careful not to do too much.
It was probably part of the producer's job to make sure that you were giving him what he needed, too.
Well, they would describe what they wanted, but the people that I first worked for were in tune with jazz. So, I mean, so it was easy to work for Bumps Blackwell or for Herb Alpert or for people like that. It was easy because they more or less knew what they wanted. Now, enter the young guys, like Mike Curb and Brian Wilson. Now, Brian of the Beach Boys, he wrote his own stuff. Phil Spector had an arranger who'd write out some things, but he'd still change the parts, and he'd say, well, I'd like this kind of a feel in this part of the tune, and we'd play a few lines like this, and he'd say yes or no, I mean, so we had a feel of what each young guy would like to hear on a certain kind of a tune. The tempo was important, the style of the tune, the way that the singer sung, like on all the Phil Spector dates, you heard Darlene Love and Gene King and Fanita singing, see, so you got an idea of the tune that way.
Speaking of Phil Spector, I know that he loved the sound of your Epiphone Emperor guitar.
Oh, that was his favorite guitar. He called me one time because he wanted me to do a date for him. And then I was already booked, and he said, well, can you send the guitar along? I said, listen, Phil, that box doesn't go without me.
I know.
That kind of thing.
All right, yeah, that's a story I'd heard. That's pretty,
yeah.
He has a lot of nerve to do that.
Well, it's very few times that I didn't work for Phil, maybe about three or four times, the rest of the stuff I was on his dates, so. And they were kind of nice. I mean, at times it got just a little rowdy because he'd love to do a lot of takes. He'd do about 35 takes in 3 hours, on one song, and it would just beat us to death, Whereas on most of the 3-hour days, you could cut 4 or 5 tunes in that time, and it was quick and it was easy. But with Phil, I mean, it was the endurance test with Phil. But
wasn't he the one who innovated wearing headphones in sessions and?
Yes, Phil was the first to have us wear earphones, and then he dumped a lot of the echo in the earphones, too. Right. He's the first one to come up with those great big baffles that were about a foot thick, too.
Yeah.
And he's the first one to use a lot of mics on the drum set.
Yeah, and it's funny, all those things are such common practices in studios today, it's hard to imagine doing it any other way.
Yeah, well, that the engineers back then too, whether it was Gold Star or RCA or United or Western or any one of those studios, that they would all come in the studio to hear us play because they wanted to make sure that the sounds that they got in the booth were the same sounds that came out of our amplifiers because they trusted us for the sound, and we could play with the extra fine technique and power. See, that was what was.
That was your job.
Important for the recording too. But I mean, plus we were never late.
Yeah, you got to be a pro.
I have to say that because there's a lot of guys that think that it's all right to be late for a job. And I said, if you're ever going to record, you're never late.